Hi everyone. So today we are going to take a look at the second section of the textile clothing and fashion syllabus. This is just a retake. If you would have looked at my previous video on textile clothing and fashion CSEC revision for section 2, the audio quality was not the best. So this is just a retake with better audio. Hopefully you'll be able to absorb the content a bit better. So we're going to first start off with some vocabulary or some terms related to color, which are just a few words along the lines of color theory that you should know. The first is colorimeter, and this is an instrument that measures the intensity of color. So as we go on, you will see what things like intensity, saturation, and these stuff mean. But just know that the colorimeter, it measures the intensity of any color. Then we have a prism, which is something that you may have seen in your science labs, etc. It's a pyramid shaped object. It's transparent, but what it does is that it splits clear light or white light into the different colors on the spectrum. So you would often find it appearing to create a rainbow, and this is because the white light is being split into different colors of light. Now we also have value, and this refers to the lightness or darkness of a color. So something with a very high value would have a very bright color, whereas something that is of low value would have a darker appearance. Intensity refers to the brightness or the dullness of a color. And we can also use the word saturation interchangeably with intensity. And this also, again, refers to the brightness or dullness of a color. So here are some examples of colors with high saturation or intensity, as well as low saturation and intensity side by side. So we have the red that looks a bit more intense or a bit more saturated on top, whereas below you see it looks a bit softer and subdued. So it's a bit more dull or it's just less intense or saturated. Now, we also have to know what hue, tint, shade, and tone mean. And I like to teach these together because by understanding what they are together, it's easier for you to distinguish or differentiate between among them all. So hue, we'll start off with hue. That is the main color or the color as it appears on the color wheel. This is the pure color. So just as how red appears on the color wheel, that is the hue. Now, you can add white, black, or gray to a hue, and it changes up the appearance of the color. So if you were to add white to a hue, let's use the example of red again. If you were to add white to a hue, you would end up with a tint. So tints are the result of white added to a hue. Now, if you were to add black to a hue, you would end up with a shade. So shades are the results of when black is added to a hue. And if you were to add gray, you would end up with a tone. So again, tones are the result of adding gray to a hue. And you have a visual representation of what this looks like. We start off with the hue on the left side, and as you add varying amounts of white, you would get different tints of the color red. And again, we start off with the hue on the left. And as you add varying amounts of gray, you would get variations in tone. And again, as you add varying amounts of black, you would get variations of shades of red. You start off with the hue on the left side, and as you progress to the right, you will see it gets darker and darker because you're adding more and more black. Now we also have pastel colors, which are colors as we know them, but just softer or a less intense appearance. So if you recall us speaking about intensity and saturation, we referred to the lower saturation colors or the lower intensity colors, or we can refer to the lower saturation or the lower intensity colors as pastels because they just have a softer or more subdued appearance. And you tend to see a lot of pastels in decor that's like for kids, Easter, etc. Neutrals are also family of colors. They don't appear in the color wheel, but they are very important for basically bringing color schemes together. They sort of calm down a color scheme, and they can either be warm, so that would be your tans and your beiges, or they could be cool neutrals like your grays. So these are not on the color wheel, but they're still considered colors, but they're just neutral. They're neither red or yellow or, yeah. So they sort of fall somewhere in between, but not on the color wheel. Now, speaking of the color wheel, let's look at how we build a color wheel or the types of colors that make up a color wheel. We have to know primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. Primary colors are the colors that exist without us mixing. So we cannot make primary colors. Our primary colors are red, blue, and yellow. Now, when you mix primary colors or by combining two primary colors in an even proportion, you're able to get secondary colors. And your secondary colors are based on what the secondary colors are determined by what two primary colors you combine. So if you were to combine red and blue, you would end up with purple. But again, it has to be in an even distribution. So the same amount of red is the same amount of blue that you combine and you get purple. Likewise, if you add yellow to blue in equal proportions, you will end up with green. And if you were to add red to yellow in equal proportions, you will end up with orange. So again, your secondary colors are the results of mixing two primary colors in equal proportions. And these would be your purples, your greens, and your oranges. Your tertiary colors are a bit more complex in that they could be a combination of two secondary colors just in unequal proportions, or they could be a combination of a secondary color and one of its primary colors. So for example, let's take it from the perspective of if I were to add primary colors in unequal proportions. If I were to add red to blue, equally I would get purple. But if I were, for some reason, to add more red than blue to this mixture, I will end up with something called red purple because the red would be the dominant primary color in that mixture. So I'm adding more red, so it's naturally going to become red purple. It's still a purple, but it's more red, right? Or it's leaning to the side of red because there's more red in it. Likewise, if I were to already have purple and add red to it, remember purple is a secondary color, but if I were to add some more red to it, then I would also end up with red purple. And purple is secondary, red is primary, but red is one of the primary colors that make up purple. So your tertiary colors could be a combination of two primary colors in unequal proportions, or it could be a mixture of a secondary color with one of its primary color components. And either way, it's going to give you a tertiary color that would be named based on the dominant primary color and the overall secondary color that's made. So, for example, using the purple as an example again, it could be a purple, but it could be a red purple. If there's more blue in it, it would be called blue purple. You have to use the name of the primary color that's dominant first before adding on the secondary color. It's like a first name and a last name. The first name is going to be the dominant primary color, and the last name is going to be the secondary color that was created as a result of the mixture. Yeah. So your examples of tertiary colors would be things like blue purple, blue green. So blue purple is just a purple that has more blue in it. Blue green will be a green that has more blue in it. Red orange, red purple, yellow green, yellow orange. And you would see how they fall in between the colors that they come from, right? So for example, you have orange in the middle here, which is a result of yellow and red mixed equally. However, if you were to have more yellow than red in that combination, you would end up with yellow orange. And yellow orange falls directly in between orange and yellow. Likewise, you have red over here. And if you were to have oranges over here as well. So you have red, you have orange. But if you were to add a bit more red to your orange, you would end up with red orange. And as you can see, red orange falls directly in between your red and your orange. So your tertiary colors fall in between the primary color and secondary color that they come from. And you can just, if you have to make a color wheel, you can just start by listing your primary colors. Then in between, you can put the secondary colors that result from the combination of the two primary colors. And then in between those, you can put the tertiary colors that result from the combination of the secondary and the primary color. Right? So that's how you basically build a color wheel. Now, on the color wheel, you have certain groups of colors that you have to know. Now, one of the color schemes, I call them color schemes because when you put colors together that go well, or combining, maybe not combining, grouping colors that go well together allow you to have a color palette for different projects or different designs. And we call that a color scheme. Now, one type of color scheme or a color scheme can result from two colors that fall directly opposite each other on the color wheel, and we call those complementary colors. They are complementary because they're directly opposite each other, so naturally they have a bit of a shocking matching relationship, right? So these would be like our reds and greens. And you typically see this combination in Christmas decor, etc. But you can have variations in the red in terms of tint or tone or shade, matching up with variations of the green in terms of tint, tone, and shade. And you can create a different effect that doesn't necessarily look like Christmas, right? But they're guaranteed to match because they fall opposite each other on the color wheel. So it's not just red and green. You can have a purple and yellow complementary pair. You can have blue and orange complementary pair. Well, this would be a yellow orange actually. But yeah, once the colors fall directly each other on the color wheel, it's a complementary pair. All right. There are other color schemes. There's like triads where whatever colors form a triangle on the color wheel, or there's like uh adjacent, I believe. There are a couple others, but on the syllabus you're required to know complementary colors, and from complementary colors you can build color schemes. Now you also need to know, I mentioned warm and cool earlier when I was talking about neutrals, but generally we also refer to the color wheel, one half of the color wheel as warm and one half of the color wheel as cool as well. And for the same purpose, if you look at colors that make you feel warmer, for want of a better word, for lack of a better word, I should say, if you look at the color wheel and you're wondering, okay, which side gives more heat or which side is, I don't want to say brighter, but these terms relating to warmth, that would be your reds and your oranges and your yellows. However, if you're thinking, what side is a bit cooler, what side is giving a more icy appearance, and that would be your blues, your greens, and your purples. All right. So it's important for you to know which colors form the warm side of the color wheel, or which colors can be considered as warm colors, and then which colors can be considered as cool colors or forming the cooler side of the color wheel. Now, colors are important in the design industry. And I mean, we probably take it for granted that colors exist, but they actually add to the variety and the beauty of a lot of our textile articles or fashion pieces. Now, the reason we add color to fabric is naturally to make fabric more attractive or to add value to the fabric. If we were just left with plain white fabric, there would not be much variation. There would not be a lot of attraction as it relates to that fabric. Also, if we were to leave fabric in its natural color, whether it's white or beige, it's it would always just have that beginner value. When you add color to fabric, you're able to enhance the value, you're able to charge more for a product because there's this perceived addition of value. Yeah. So your two main reasons for coloring fabrics would be to make it more attractive and to add value to the fabric. Now, how do we color fabrics? There's multiple ways, but dyeing is one of the major ways of, or one of the more popular ways of adding color to fabric. We can look at a couple others a little later down. Now, dyes can either be natural or they can be synthetic. These are your general two sources of dyes, right? Natural dyes, you'll see them coming from plants or animals, and sometimes even minerals. Yeah. Um, you tend to see it coming a lot from your plants and animals, though. So, like your roots and your berries and your barks and your leaves, these are examples of where you can get some natural dyes from. And there are also some insects and fungi as well that you're able to get natural dyes from. So the pigments, either in their skins or in the bark of the tree, whatever it is, the pigments produce natural dyes, or they're used as natural dyes. Now, synthetic dyes are created in the lab. So these are not naturally sourced. They are a combination of chemicals that produce sometimes even richer pigments, and they tend to be a bit more common in mass production and stuff because it's just more feasible, or it's just more efficient to use some of these synthetic dyes. Not that it's better, but they sometimes also have their effects or disadvantages, but it tends to be used a lot more in mass production, fast fashion, etc., because it's just easier to source as it's synthetic. Um, Now let's look at some methods of applying color. Like I said, dyeing is a major or a very popular method of applying color, and do you can dye fabric through immersion method, and that was originally the way of dyeing fabric. However, over time we found a lot of other techniques to apply dye to fabric. So for example, I've seen using squeeze bottles or sprinkling dye in varying areas, and it really depends on the what that final um, look or pattern or design you're going for. But typically, immersion or immersing the fabric into a dye bath was the original way of applying color when it came to dyeing fabrics. And what I mean by immersing your fabric into a dye bath is basically submerging the fabric into a mixture of your dye, water, and a mordant. And later you'll realize that a mordant is something that allows a chemical or a substance that allows your dye to fix itself more to the fabric. So your dye is able to last longer. It's not going to wash away very easily because that mordant helps to bind the color to the fibers of the fabric. So it's there to stay. No, like I said, immersion dyeing is one way to dye a fabric. And this is if you're dyeing a fabric completely, no design, just a color plain. Now, if you want to incorporate designs to your fabric, you're going to have to find ways to avoid the dye falling on some spots. So the spots that your dye does not fall on or does not absorb on, this would be where your designs come to life. Now, this concept is called resist dyeing. So, whatever areas you're able to resist the dye, that is the areas that would form your design. And we have a bunch of methods of resist dyeing, and we're going to look at a few today. One of the common examples of resist dyeing is tie dyeing. And this is where we use strings or rubber bands to actually tie the fabric at different spots or in different designs in different ways to create different designs using different techniques. And when we immerse this fabric into the dye bath, or if we're applying our dye using squeeze bottles or whatever it is, once the dye adheres to the fabric, the areas that are tied do not get the dye. So when you remove these rubber bands or the strings, you would reveal a beautiful design whether it's the color in one spot and then the white spots in some area, or you use multiple colors, it reveals a beautiful design. And you can again go in with another color, whether you immerse it into dye again, and you can create beautiful patterns. The thing with tie dyeing is that it's not regular. It's not like a regular pattern you're going to get. A lot of it sometimes ends up being abstract. You can create expected designs, but it's not going to, there are no two pieces that would be exactly the same, right? So that's just something to note. Batiking is another method of resist dyeing. And again, I should mention, I have the notes on screen, but I should mention that if you are immersing this into a dye bath, your dye bath should be made from, if it's a warm water dye, your warm water, your dye, as well as your mordant. And you can look on the dyeing packet instructions to be better guided as to how to make that dye bath. Or if you're using a squeeze bottle, you can look for instructions on how to mix that mixture to get the best results. But ensuring that you have the correct proportions of water versus dye versus mordant ensures that you would be able to have the best results in terms of how bright or how intense the colors are. So again, batiking is another example of a resist dye method. In this case, you're using wax instead of strings or rubber bands, etc. So where you apply the wax is where your design would be formed, because the dye is not going to be absorbed in those areas. Typically or traditionally, we use a tool called a jantin, and this is what it looks like. You will dip this into the wax mixture, and this wax mixture can be a combination of paraffin, which is your candle wax, and beeswax. Uh, Different people use different ratios of the two waxes. I have known one particular design fabric design company to use just plain beeswax, but a mixture, like a half mixture of paraffin and beeswax, can give a decent Janssen or batiking experience, because the paraffin and the beeswax come together to create a nice consistency that you can sometimes crack to create a further, more intricate design. Or you can leave it plain without cracking so that when you do remove the dye, it's a nice smooth application for your design. But it varies whether people use straight beeswax or a mixture of paraffin and beeswax. Some people also just use paraffin. So it really depends, and I guess what's available. But according to the syllabus, you would use a mixture to be able to get a nice consistency that you can further manipulate to create different designs. So here you're looking at the Jantin. It has an opening for you to put the wax. Once the wax is melted, you could dip this instrument into the wax. It sort of collects that wax like a funnel, and the smaller part of the shantin would release this wax in a nice controlled manner, and you just apply it however you see fit based on your design. Alternatively, you can use tools like your paint brushes. I've known some students have like sprinkled it in different ways. So you can find different ways to apply. If you do not have your jantin, you can find different ways to apply your wax. But generally, once you apply your wax, wherever you apply your wax, that is where your design is formed. Or however you apply your wax, that is how your design is going to be formed. So in this picture, you can see it was sort of a swirl design. And once that wax is removed, that is the area that would remain white. You can go in again with a lighter dye to, if you want a two-color dye experience, which I should also mention, excuse me. If you are using two colors, you want to go in with the darker color first. And when you remove whatever resist method, you can go in with a lighter color. Reason why you would start with the darker color is because using that darker color as a base allows you to be able to utilize a lighter color after without it being masked. If you were to start off with a lighter color and then you remove your resist methods and you go in with a darker color, everything would be dark. Or your final piece would be completely whatever that dark color is. So you want to start off with your dark color and then go in with your lighter colors after if you're doing two or more colors. Bear in mind that the more colors you add, the more mixing would take place. So let's say you started off with a dark blue. What you would end up with if you probably add a yellow is something that looks a bit more on the green side because your yellow would interact with your blue. Yeah, so that's just another thing to note. But yes, when you're removing the batik wax, this this process requires you can scrape some of it off, and you will also place the fabric in between paper towels or napkins and press to be able to melt all the wax and have it absorbed into these two layers. So you're not essentially just removing the wax physically. You can also melt it away. If you use a cold water dye, you can also boil the wax out. So you can place the finished product, you can scrape some away, and you can place that finished fabric design into a boiling pot of water, and the wax will eventually boil out. You can skim it off with a ladle or a wooden spoon or something. And once you remove your fabric, it should be good. But the only thing you have to be mindful of is that you have to use a cold water dye if you're going to use that method to remove your wax. Now, apart from tie dyeing and batiking, you also have clam dyeing. This is not something that I've personally tried before, but you can use different shapes of wooden blocks. Well, you can either tie them together, or if you have clamps, you can uh you're able to tighten the clamps to get them compressed together. So the fabric is in between there, and whatever piece of the fabric is compressed by these wooden blocks, that is the piece of fabric that would remain white or would not absorb the dye. So once you immerse this fabric into the dye with the clamps, when you remove it, you're going to end up with repeated designs that resemble whatever shape of block you would have used. And it's a repeated concept. Once you apply the resist method, you apply the dye, you remove the resist method, you end up with a design, right? So whether it is that you use strings for the tie dye, you use wax for the batik, you use wooden blocks for the clamp dyeing, or you use stitches for the tritic, at the end of the day, you apply your resist, you apply your dye, you remove your resist, and you reveal your design. You can also use starch paste, which is very much like the batik method. Instead of using wax, however, you're using starch, or I've seen students use Elmer's glue. This also works. No, like I said, dyeing is a very common means of applying color to fabric. However, there are other methods that you can use to apply color to fabric, and one of those is printing. Also, a very popular method because this now adds more regularized images or designs to your fabric. Like I said, with your dyeing, you tend to not get you're not going to get two of the exact same pieces, but with printing, you have a bit more control over that. And you have three methods of printing that we're going to learn about. So with printing, you're generally applying designs you can use paint, you can use uh, I want to say ink, I could be wrong, but in like your screen printing, etc., that would be another pigment that you're using. It wouldn't necessarily be paint. Now, we have the three types: screen printing, roller printing, and block printing. With the screen printing, you have a setup that requires you to have a screen, a squeegee, and the image is on that screen, photo emulsion screen. So as you apply your ink to the screen and you distribute it evenly across your screen, when you remove this, you would end up with a printed image on the surface of whatever it is, whether it's your fabric or a t-shirt, etc. This is something that I would have seen being done younger, and we've had the setup for some of our students, and it's really an interesting project to do. So if you do have the chance to do it, it's really fun. Roller printing, this is more commercial, so you'll have, well, I want to say it's more commercial, but I'm sure you can probably find a way to maybe use a lint roller or something to have a similar experience, a DIY experience. But what this is that you'll have large cylinders with whatever pigment being fed into these cylinders, and these cylinders roll onto your bolt of fabrics. As the fabric passes below, these cylinders are applying the design repeatedly on this length of fabric, right? So it's more of a commercial setup. But like I said, I'm sure you can probably figure out how to do a DIY version of this, maybe with something like a lint roller or paper towel center or something like that. Another very common one is block printing, and this is probably one of the easier ones to do because you can create your design and put it onto a block of wood, or you can do it on a sponge, you can do it on a potato. And once you create your design, you just apply it into your paint or whatever colorant you're using, dye, etc. And then you stamp it onto your fabric in in whatever your desired repeated pattern is gonna be like. So some people might want to do it in a regular grid pattern. Sometimes it's probably just the bottom of the fabric you want to do. It really depends on what design you're going for, or what's the vibe that you're going for. But this is one of the easier ways to do printing because it just requires you to apply that design motive onto the paint or the ink or dye or whatever it is, and then apply it to the surface of your fabric. Now, we also have surface techniques that allow us to apply color to fabric. We have techniques like painting, which is you basically applying paint, whether it's fabric paint or acrylic paint, onto fabric using paint brushes, sponges. Sometimes people use potatoes, sometimes people use airbrush, but this creates a design onto your fabric that you can control. Stenciling is another way of applying designs, but this one is where you sort of have a template, like a pre-done template, that you just apply your paint or whatever colorant you have over it. Now, if you want to create a stencil, you can do that manually, or you can, you know, you have so much different technology options right now. You can use the Cricut or the Cricut feature, applic software and tools to be able to cut out specific designs, or you can use other computer aided design software to allow you to design and then cut out your designs to create your template. And as you can see, you place it over your fabric, you apply your paint or whatever colorant you want to use over that, and once you remove that stencil, you have a beautiful design. Embroidering is one of my favorites because it's something that allows you to really create these designs by hand through hand sewing, whereas everything else would have been using paint or ink or different colorants. This one is actually back to your good old needle and thread. Your embroidery threads vary in terms of thickness, in terms of material, and colors, etc. And you can use varying sewing techniques or embroidery designs, embroidery stitches to create different designs. So, for example, you would see like this is somewhat of a satin stitch. It's not very close, This is probably a stem stitch. You have things like chain stitch. This is probably a lazy daisy. So different stitches create different effects for you to bring a design to life. We also have texturing, and texturing is really creating a raised appearance or tactile experience to fabric. And if you notice, this could be done manually, it can be done commercially. You can literally manipulate your fabric in whatever ways once it creates a tactile effect. So whether it's tying or whether it's some people might do like pleats and stitch in different directions, etc. Once it creates that raised tactile effect, it's considered texturing. Now, apart from designing your fabric with colors, you also have fabric finishes, which are substances that you use to add or enhance your fabric. So it's like you can have basic fabric or you can have super fabric, and the different techniques or the different processes that you pass these fabrics through, these are what we refer to as fabric finishes, or I should say that the substances that might be added to these fabrics, you can consider those fabric finishes. Now, you have three categories. You have preparatory, functional, and decorative or aesthetic, right? Now, your preparatory fabric finishes, these allow you to get the fabric ready for another process. So it's going to your fabric probably needs to be dyed. You want to make sure that it is as white as possible. So you're going to do bleaching, right? Singeing is to ensure that, your fabric is smooth. Maybe you have to do some other kind of sewing process on your fabric. So you want to ensure that it's smooth so you can do singeing. Degumming. Some fabrics like silk, if you know how silk is produced, then you know it comes from a silkworm, and the cocoon of the silkworm usually has a gummy paste that basically keeps the fibers together, because it's to protect the silkworm, right? Now, once you have to unravel that, there's still a lot of gum left in the fabric once you have um, unravel the silk fiber, woven it and everything, there can still be gum residue there. So degumming is also another preparatory finish because it gets the fabric ready for whatever is the next step, right? So your preparatory finishes, they allow your fabric to be prepared or to be ready for another stage. Your functional finishes are more for specific performances or specific roles that fabric may have to perform, right? So sizing is to ensure that your fabric is a bit more heavy, it's a bit more stiff, it's a bit more firm. Weighing is also to ensure that it has a bit more body to it. Anti-static reduces static buildup. Mercerization gives strength as well as shine. Lush means shine, and you tend to have mercerization happening on cotton. And then you have other examples like your stain resistance, flame resistance, shrink resistance, etc. Yeah. Now, decorative, these ones are just for aesthetics. So it's really just to enhance the appearance of your fabric. You have moiring, which gives that kind of woody effect, embossing, which gives a raised effect. And I'm sure you've seen embossing not just on fabric, but even on like greeting cards and so on, that raised effect where it's like it's not like engraving is more like okay, a lowered effect, and embossing is like the raised version of that, so your designs kind of pop out from the surface. Napping is a fuzzy or a brushed effect surface, and then plissing is this kind of crinkled um sort of like a condensed effect to your fabric, right? You also have calendering, which gives you a glossy effect, and you have other examples like screen printing and dyeing and stuff that we would have looked at previously when we spoke about color and fabric. So these also can fall under design or aesthetic or decorative fabric finishes. But just know that your fabric finishes enhance the fabric, whether it's for preparation for a next role or next stage, function, specific purposes or for decorative purposes. Yeah. So that is it essentially for section 2. Feel free to go through the syllabus and see if there's anything that was probably missed, and you can always just hit me up in the comments and I can always get back to you. But I hope this video helps, and I hope the audio is much better than the last time. Bye bye for now. Take care.